fuck is wrong with you? Why don't you leave us alone? You heard it. Give her a pizza.
What's going on, ladies and gents of YouTube? My name is Connor, aka President CM, aka Atambo Manombe, and I am so glad to welcome you back to the series that Lee from Drum Dum said he loved and Lee from Customer Service at Comcast said he had never heard of. And of course, I am talking about 10 Points of Redemption. And today we are running through quite an interesting film indeed. One that I feel is often too forgotten in the realm of horror. And I, of course, am talking about Leatherface, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3. Not to be confused with the new movie called Leatherface in the same little universe. I don't know what that's all about, but this movie was released in 1990, directed by Jeff Burr, and it stars Kate Hodge, Ken Furry, and of course a young Viggo Mortensen, who would go on to star in films such as The Lord of the Rings. He's got a new movie coming out. I don't know what it's called, but it looks pretty good. But today we're not talking about those movies. We're talking about a Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3. Now, this is a movie, like I said, I feel like it's over-forgotten. I feel like people don't talk about it enough, and it was actually suggested to me to do, and so I'm gonna go ahead and do it. I'm gonna go ahead and make this video, and we're gonna run through the 10 points of redemption for this movie. What did you think it was gonna be? You read the title, you've seen it before, so we're gonna run through this. Of course, I am the president, so everything I say goes, and I urge you to go down below and comment what you want to see next in this series, because I'm very excited to do it again. And this, of course, is going to be part of a double header, so look out for that second video. Should be up shortly after this one. But right now, we're going to dive into the 10 points of redemption for Leatherface, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3.
Some tales are told, then soon forgotten. But a legend is forever. Leatherface, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3.
I'm gonna service you real good, ma'am. Don't you worry about it.
Now, point number one for this movie is going to be the atmosphere. Now, the atmosphere in this film is sort of different from the first two movies while staying across the same lines. This one feels sort of more heavy, more metal, sort of a darker tone to it. And that really helps out because this movie, if you're going into it thinking, oh, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a super violent series and this movie's going to follow right along, yes and no. The violence is really toned down in this movie compared to the second film. The first one didn't have as much blood and violence as people thought. It just sort of made you think it did. But while the first one relied on a more grungy, real feel, and the second one was real surreal, this one kind of takes both of those and turns them into a modern take on it for the time. Back in 1990, it sort of fits that late 80s, early 90s sort of feel to it, but it goes hard with like the metal tone, and it tries to create a creepier atmosphere for the film than the first two did, taking it a little bit more seriously while still adding in those comedic values to it. Overall, I think the atmosphere for this movie sort of outdoes the second movie. While I prefer the second movie over this one, I feel like the atmosphere of this one really helps it. When you look at how toned down the violence is and how sort of bland the character of Leatherface is in this movie, the atmosphere really helps out in carrying it forward and making it something better than it should have been. And that's going to lead me to talk about the cinematography of this movie. The set design was great, and that helped out a lot with the cinematography in this film, from the color palette that they used to the surreal sort of shots they had, including one that's really cool of a truck just turning on. Like, this movie does a very good job of using the elements around it and using the environment to create a creepy atmosphere and really making the movie into this beautiful looking film. A lot of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies have that element to it, especially the second one has a lot of cool shots, a lot of cool sets, but I think this one just doubles down on that. It really does a great job of creating this amazing atmosphere with these great shots, and the movie just looks beautiful overall. I think it's hard for me to just describe it to you. I think it's one of those things you really have to see and pay attention to really fully appreciate. Point number 3 is going to be the clever setup for the character of Michelle. Now, in a lot of times these movies, they'll set up the character, but it won't be done very well. I think the first one did a good job of it. The second one did it okay, but this one I think did a really good job of setting up how this character is going to react and how this character is going to be throughout this film. One of the things in the beginning that they did was they set up the relationship with the character of Ryan that she had to where they're close and they care about each other, but not enough for her to be completely devastated and destroyed by his death if that is to happen in the future. There's the scene where she hits the armadillo and she's not able to put it out of its misery with the rock, which is definitely going to come back later in the film, and it just sets her up as this not so useless character who's just who seems like she just needs to get where she needs to be, and she's going to do whatever she needs to do to get there. Not exactly a weak character, but not a super strong character as well, at least when you're introduced to her, and I think it really pays off in the end when you see her finally get to that point. And I really just think that out of all the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies in setting up the final girl sort of deal, even though this one had a final girl and a final guy, I think it did a very good job in setting up her morals, her character, and showing us what she would become and help guide us to what she would become by the end of the film. Now, point number 4 is going to be the introduction of Leatherface. His introduction in the film is one of the better ones of the franchise. Now, I think in the first one it's a lot scarier when you first see him and you first see what he's capable of, but in this one it's sort of like a build, an attention build, and honestly, despite the fact that, as I mentioned before, Leatherface is pretty bland in this movie compared to in other films, he kind of takes a back seat, and I think when you do that, you have to have something for us to still grab onto with him, and I think his introduction in this movie is exactly that. It's enough for us to carry through and enough for us to get to the point where he does start to get bland and we start to see other members of the family. And honestly, I think the beginning of this movie, up until we get to the actual Sawyer house itself, is one of the better ones in the franchise when you look at how Leatherface is portrayed. I mean, he's scary, he seems brutal, he seems more serious in tone, despite the fact that, you know, the first one treated him pretty seriously. This one just doubles down on treating him more seriously than the second one did. And like I said, up until they get to the Sawyer house, it's one of the best, Leatherface introductions, one of the best openings of the movie that any film has in the franchise. Now, point number 5 is going to be that the power of the Sawyer family is shown through the character of Sarah, and it is done pretty well. The character of Sarah is introduced, and we don't really exactly, I guess we don't really know her name. I think she says it at one point, but it's not a big part of the story. But it plays into more of the overall story of the franchise than we might realize. The character of Sarah, if you don't know, was introduced in this movie in the very beginning, but just in a little glimpse. We don't see more of her until a little later when she has an interaction with Ken Furry's character of Benny. And basically her point was, like, her story behind her is that, her and her sisters got caught in some kind of trap by the Sawyer family, and she's just been trapped on the property ever since and lost all of her sisters. They all died, and now she's here to fend for herself, and she's trapped on this property. And I think the way she acts, you can still see that sense of urgency in her, you can still see that sense of her being a human being, but the things that she's experienced in this area and the things that the Sawyers put her through have made her almost as insane as they are. And I think that really helps in showing the power of this family, especially in a movie where they might not shine as much as they did in the second one. I still think that her setup and showing the power that this family has and how much they can really destroy a person and get them to their crazy mental state. I think that introduction of that character really helped that move along really well. Point number 6 is going to be the chainsaw, and do I have to say anything more? That thing is badass. I mean, look at this thing. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want to fuck with anybody holding something like this. Now, point number 7 is actually going to be the violence, which is really funny that I'm saying this because, as I said earlier, the violence is really toned down in this film, and it's not really helped by the fact that the MPAA sort of butchered this movie, gave it an X rating before it came out. And now in watching behind the scenes clips, you can see that some of the prosthetics didn't work exactly as well as they thought they might have worked out. So a lot of those scenes were cut. One in particular is a scene where they sort of drop a hammer on a character's head, and everybody complains that they cut away from that. In seeing the behind the scenes, it's much better that they did cut away from it. But the rest of the effects in this movie and the rest of the violence in this film are very good. The effects was actually done by Greg Nicotero, who has directed some of the Walking Dead episodes. He did the special effects in one of my favorite films, Halloween 5. Yes, I love Halloween 5. Go back and watch my videos if you haven't seen those about Halloween 5. But Greg did a great job in this film. From what we do see, there's a character who experiences some issues that might involve some nails in their hands. That's done very well. The rest of the violence that is in this movie looks great. It feels great. And because it's toned down so much, the violence that we do see actually sort of means more, especially in the franchise. It sort of goes back to how the first one was, where the violence that you saw sort of makes it feel like it's more. In this movie, it doesn't make you feel like there's more than there is, but it does make you feel like when it does happen, it's a special thing and something that you should pay attention to. So great job to Greg, and great job to the effects team that did this, because the violence, I thought what we did see was done very well. Point number 8 is going to be Ken Furry as Benny. Now, Benny is just a badass. Whether he is sneaking around trying to pass the Beast in peace, of course the Beast being Leatherface, or he's scrapping with Leatherface in dark waters filled with the victims of the Sawyer family, everything he does turns to gold in this movie, in my opinion. I think he is one of the most underrated horror icons. It's great that Rob Zombie put him in his Halloween film. It's great that we get to see him in The Lords of Salem, another Rob Zombie picture, and he does great in this, almost as good as his character in Dawn of the Dead, in my opinion, and almost single-handedly carries this film, and you'll see why I say almost later on in this movie. Does a very great job of being the final guy, per se, and pretty much is one of the biggest reasons you should go out and watch this movie. So take my word for it. Benny's a badass. Watch this movie for Ken Furry. Now, in the last point, I mentioned the victims of the Sawyer family. Moving on to my next point, of course, point number 9, we're almost done with this, is going to be the Sawyer family itself. Now, for the second film in a row, Leatherface is outshined by a member of his family. And there are a couple members of this family as a whole that I think are worth looking at. But ultimately, the family outshines Leatherface, which is strange because Leatherface is the title character of this movie. But honestly, stellar job to the cast. Viggo Mortensen plays Tex, who's a pretty good character. We see him, they sort of kind of try to swerve us a little bit, and you'll see what I mean if you watch this movie. I don't want to spoil too much in this because this is one of those that I feel like a lot of people haven't seen, and so I want them to go see it. So Viggo Mortensen as Tex is a fairly good character, very good introduction to that actor. Joe Unger is great as the character of Tink Sawyer. Even Miriam Bird Netherly is great as the mama character, as Mama Sawyer. But honestly, when you look at this movie, the show is truly stolen by 2 members of the Sawyer family, and that's Jennifer Blanco as the little girl character. She does a fantastic job, but mostly this movie is stolen by Tom Everett and his portrayal of Alfredo Sawyer. This guy is just amazing. Take my word for it. This guy, you watch this movie and you'll see he alone is enough of a reason to go watch this movie, to have this movie, to own it. I got a DVD and a Blu-ray copy, and part of that reason is because of how awesome the character of Alfredo is. Please, please watch this movie for that character alone. And point number 10, and this one is going to be a little bit controversial maybe because this is something that I've seen some critics of this movie talk about, and it's the ending. The ending of this movie I felt was pretty awesome. Between the poetic nature of Michelle's actions during the fight with Leatherface, The hilarity from Alfredo, as like I said earlier, he's enough of a reason to watch this movie. The badassness of Ken Furry's character Benny. And of course, you know, it showed us how to call back to the first movie without ripping off the ending. And it did a good job of that, and it cut off before, you know, anything, till it seemed more like a ripoff. But it did a good job of calling back to the original. In my opinion, it was a great way to close out the third chapter of this franchise, and I really wish that they would have continued this story after this film. It didn't do as well as many people assumed it would, but ultimately, good way to close out this trilogy, and in my opinion, one of the better endings of the franchise when you look at the poetic nature of it, the funny elements with Alfredo, and the cool elements from the character of Leatherface and Ken Furry's character Benny. One of the better endings, in my opinion, of the franchise. And that's going to do it for this video, guys. This has been 10 Points of Redemption for Leatherface Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 3. Let me know what you think about this movie in the comments. Like I said, it's one that I feel is forgotten too much. It's not talked about enough, in my opinion. A good movie overall, and one that I think is definitely worth checking out, especially if you have a couple bucks. It's not too expensive to buy on Blu-ray. You can find it on DVD, probably at a secondhand shop by you. Yeah, it might not be new, but I think it's worth picking up personally, especially if you're a fan of the first two Texas Chainsaw movies. But ultimately, guys, I hope this video has, you know, convinced you to take a second chance if you didn't like it before, has convinced you to watch it if you haven't seen it before. And that's going to do it for today's video, guys. Like I said before, let me know in the comments what you want to see next. If you want to see me do something new, if you want to see me review more movies instead of 10 Points of Redemption, let me know what you want to see in this series of 10 Points of Redemption. I'm a fair president, so I do look at the comments and I do see what you guys like, and I try to follow it, you know, as much as I can. Other than that, guys, that's going to do it for today. I, of course, have been Connor, aka President CM, and I will see you in the next video.